Welcome to our deep dive into English spelling. I know it could be tough when you're learning English in a new country, especially when it comes to spelling.
Absolutely. It's like a whole new world.
And today we're focusing on you guys who are learning English in a brand new country and haven't had that typical elementary school experience.
Right. Starting from scratch.
And we really admire your bravery for taking on this challenge.
It's incredible. You're basically building a whole new understanding of language.
And we're here to help guide you through the sometimes confusing world of English spelling.
Because believe it or not, there are actually some helpful rules hidden in there.
Yeah, those rules can make a huge difference, right?
Absolutely. Once you start to see the patterns, it becomes way easier.
So we're going to dive into 12 key spelling rules today.
We'll be looking at tricky vowels and consonants, breaking down those mysterious prefixes and suffixes.
And even exploring those 6 main vowel types that are kind of like the foundation of English pronunciation.
Exactly. They're like the building blocks.
So are you ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's kick things off with a rule that often trips people up, even native speakers.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. That sneaky letter Y.
Yes. Y can be a real chameleon.
Sometimes it acts like a vowel, sometimes like a consonant. It all depends on where it is in the word, right?
Right. But there's one rule that can be super helpful. When you're adding a suffix to a word that ends in Y, like ed, a, or est.
That Y often changes to an I.
Exactly. Think about the word cry. When you want to say someone cried in the past tense.
That Y becomes an I.
Right. And it's the same with the word ugly, to say something is uglier. You switch that Y to an I, and it happens with a bunch of other words too, like family becoming families.
So it's like the Y is trying to make the word easier to say by switching to an I before those vowels.
Yeah, it's a little smoother that way.
Clever Y. But of course, English loves its exceptions, right?
Of course. There are always a few words that like to break the rules.
Like rebels.
Haha, exactly. Like play becomes player and pray becomes prayer. They just hold on to that Y no matter what. And then there are those odd plurals like laid, which comes from lay.
English spelling definitely keeps us on our toes.
It does. Okay, so we've tackled Y. Let's move on to a rule that might be a bit more familiar.
Oh, I think I know this one. Are you talking about the I before E rule?
You got it. It's a classic.
I'm sure many of our listeners have heard that rhyme before. I before E, except after C.
It works like a charm in words like receive, deceive, and sealing.
But, as with many things in English, there's a twist.
Always a twist.
So what are the exceptions?
Well, when that E combination makes an A sound, the rule goes out the window.
Like in the words neighbor, way, and ate. They all have that E after C, but they make the A sound.
Right. And it's interesting to think about why those exceptions exist. Often it's because of the history of the word. English has borrowed words from so many different languages.
So those borrowed spellings stick around, even if they don't really fit the normal rules.
Exactly. It's like a little reminder that language is constantly evolving.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about those tricky letters, Y and I and E. Now let's zoom out a bit and talk about something that's super fundamental to words.
You mean syllables?
Yes,
Okay.
every single syllable needs a vowel, right?
That's right. It's a basic but important rule.
It's kind of like vowels are the breath of a word, and the syllables are the beats. Just like you need breath for every beat when you're talking or singing, every syllable needs a vowel to give it that sound and rhythm.
Such a great way to put it.
So words like raisin, bartender, and excitement, they all have those vowel buddies in each syllable.
And that's what creates that smooth flow when we speak.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about another vowel rule that can be confusing, the silent E.
Ah, the silent E. It's like a little ninja at the end of a word.
It secretly changes the vowel sound that comes before it.
Exactly. It's not just hanging out there for no reason. It's doing a very important job.
And what's that job?
It signals that the vowel before it should have a long sound. For example, in the word kite, that E at the end is what makes the I sound long. But in the word kitten, without that E, the I has a short sound.
It's like that silent E is giving the vowel a power boost.
Exactly. But here's a question for you. Does that silent E always disappear when we add a suffix to a word?
That's a good question.
What do you think?
Well, I know sometimes it does disappear, but I'm not sure if it always does.
You're right, it doesn't always disappear. There are some words where it likes to stick around.
Really? Can you give me an example?
Sure, take the word mileage. Even with that added age, the E stays right where it is to keep that long I sound.
Wow, so it's not always a case of out with the old E, when a suffix comes along.
Nope. English spelling likes to keep us on our toes. All right, are you ready for a rule that's all about doubling the fun literally?
Oh yeah, let's talk about double consonants. This is where I think the floss rule comes in handy.
Exactly. It's a great way to remember it.
So remind me, how does that floss rule work?
Well, it's all about those one-syllable words with a short vowel sound.
Like staff, fill, and pass.
Perfect examples. When you want to add a suffix to these words like ing or ed, you've got to double that final consonant. Think of it like flossing. You go back and forth to make sure you get everything.
Staff becomes staffing, fill becomes filling, and pass becomes passing. It's like those consonants are getting extra emphasis.
That's a great way to think about it. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about a rule that's all about making words plural. You know, adding s and is to make words mean more than one.
Yeah, this seems like a pretty simple rule at first glance, but I know there are some little details that can trip people up.
You're right. Most of the time you just add an s to the end of a word to make it plural. You know, like cat becoming cats or dog becoming dogs. But sometimes you need to use s instead.
So when do we use is?
If a word ends in brish, x, or z, then you add e is to make it plural. So bus becomes buses, box becomes boxes, and church becomes churches. It's all about making those plurals easier to say.
Ah, so those es endings are smoothing out the sounds.
Exactly. And speaking of sounds, let's talk about a rule that involves a letter that never likes to be followed by an s.
I wonder which letter you're talking about.
The letter x.
Oh, X. What's the rule for X?
It has a very particular rule. It never wants to be followed by an s.
Really? So what happens when you need that S sound after an X?
Well, instead of using an s, you use a c to get that s sound.
Oh, I see. So that's why we have words like excite, accept, and excel, all using C to create that S sound after the X. It's like a secret code within the English language.
I love that. A secret code. Okay, are you ready for a quick refresher on those short vowel sounds?
Oh, yeah. Those are important.
If we have a one-syllable word with just one vowel in the middle, that vowel usually has a short sound, right?
Right. Like the words cat, dog, and hat. Short and sweet.
Exactly. Those short vowels are the workhorses of the English language.
They really are. Okay, let's move on to the rule for using sync. It's a small detail, but can make a big difference when you're trying to spell a word correctly.
You're right. So when do we use shik?
I think it has something to do with the vowel sound before the K sound.
You're exactly right. If a word has a short vowel sound and ends in a K sound, then you use sick. But if there's a long vowel sound or a consonant before the K sound, then you just use K.
So the word duck has that short vowel and uses E, but peak has that long vowel and just uses E. It seems simple enough, but I bet it can be easy to mix them up sometimes.
Absolutely. But like with anything, practice makes perfect.
Okay, let's talk about a rule that's all about keeping things whole.
What do you mean?
Well, what happens when you add a suffix to a word that ends in a vowel followed by Y?
Ah, I see what you mean. In those cases, all the letters stay together. No need to drop or change anything.
So if we take the word journey and want to say someone is journeying, all those letters stay put. Same with toy becoming toyed. It's like a little word family sticking together.
Exactly. Which brings us to two more rules before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Let's talk about prefixes. Those little word parts that come at the beginning of a word and can change its meaning.
Yeah, prefixes are like puzzle pieces that add these extra layers of meaning. And one that seems to pop up a lot is owl. What's the deal with owl?
The prefix "al" is actually just a shortened form of the word all. It's like a little shortcut.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's a quicker way of saying all.
Exactly. And you see it in so many common words like almost, always, and altogether.
Okay, for our final rule in this part, let's talk about two letters that are practically inseparable in the English language.
Q and U?
You got it.
Yeah.
They're practically best friends.
In almost every case, when you see a Q, a U is right behind it.
Think of words like question, quiet, and bouquet. They all have that inseparable Q duo.
There are a few rare exceptions, like fakir, but for the most part, you can count on Q and U sticking together.
Or like a power couple of the alphabet. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have. From tricky Y endings to inseparable QU buddies, we've explored some really important spelling rules.
And I hope our listeners are starting to see how understanding these patterns can make a big difference in their English spelling journey.
Me too. Remember, it's all about practice and patience. The more you see these patterns, the easier they'll become. Welcome back to our deep dive. You know, it's seriously impressive that you're all tackling English spelling without that traditional elementary school background.
It's true. You're all creating your own learning paths. And speaking of paths, I'm feeling much more confident about navigating English spelling after all those rules we covered in the first part.
That's great to hear, but we're just getting started.
Oh, there's more. What else is there to explore in this wild world of spelling?
Well, we've talked a lot about individual letters and sounds, but now let's zoom out a bit. Let's see how those pieces work together.
What do you mean?
I'm talking about syllables.
Syllables, yeah.
Syllables are like the building blocks of words, and knowing how they work can make a big difference, not just for your pronunciation, but for spelling, too.
Okay, syllables. I vaguely remember learning about them, but they always seemed a little abstract to me. How can understanding syllables actually help me spell better?
Think of it this way. When you can break a word down into its syllables, it's like you're taking this big, complicated puzzle and dividing it into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Oh, I see. So instead of looking at the whole word, I can focus on those smaller parts.
Exactly. And suddenly those long, intimidating words become much easier to decode.
That makes sense. So how do we actually figure out the syllables in a word? Is there a trick?
One helpful tip is to feel the beats in a word as you say it out loud. Each beat is a syllable. Try it with the word banana. Can you feel those 3 distinct beats? Banana.
Oh, yeah. 3 beats, 3 syllables.
Exactly. Now, how do you think those syllables connect to spelling?
Well, each syllable needs a vowel to create that beat, right?
You got it. And depending on the type of syllable, that vowel sound can be short or long, which affects how we spell the word.
Ah, so those vowel sounds we talked about earlier are playing a role in syllables too. It's all starting to connect. Can you give me some examples of how those syllable types actually affect spelling?
Sure. Let's look at the word chocolate. It has 3 syllables. Chocolate. The first syllable, choc, is what we call a closed syllable because it ends in a consonant.
Okay.
And in closed syllables, the vowel sound is usually short. That's why we spell it with just an O instead of OE, which would make a long vowel sound.
So the type of syllable tells us whether the vowel sound is short or long, which then affects the spelling.
Precisely. But closed syllables aren't the only type. We also have open syllables.
Open syllables.
Yes. They end in a vowel sound and usually have a long vowel sound. Think of words like go or me. And then there are vowel consonant E syllables, or VCE syllables for short.
Oh, those are the ones where that silent E at the end makes the vowel sound long.
You got it. Like in words like cake, like, or home.
It's incredible how much power that silent E has.
Right. It's a busy little letter. But wait, there's more.
More syllable types.
Oh, yeah. We've got R-controlled syllables, where the vowel sound is influenced by the letter R, like in car, her, and bird. And then there are vowel team syllables, where 2 vowels work together to make one sound, like in team or boat.
Yeah, there's a lot to remember. But I'm starting to see how knowing these patterns can help me become a better speller.
Exactly. It's like having a secret decoder ring for words.
I like that. Now, what about those prefixes and suffixes? How do those fit into this whole spelling puzzle?
Prefixes and suffixes are like building blocks for words. They can completely change a word's meaning, and they can also affect spelling.
We talked about the prefix L earlier. Are there any other prefixes that commonly affect spelling?
Definitely. Prefixes like un, re, dis, and miss are used all the time, and they usually don't cause any spelling changes. But sometimes adding a prefix can create a double consonant situation.
Double consonants, like when we have to double the last letter.
Exactly. For example, if you add the prefix un to the word necessary, you get unnecessary with 2 N's.
Ah, so prefixes can sometimes trigger those double consonant rules we learned about earlier.
You got it. What about suffixes? Do you think they cause any spelling shakeups?
Well, we talked about how adding ed can sometimes change a Y to an I, but are there other examples?
Of course. Let's look at the suffix ing. When you add ing to a word that ends in a silent E, you usually drop the E before adding the suffix.
Oh, right. Like hope becomes hoping and write becomes writing. It's like that silent E steps aside to make room for the ing.
That's a great way to think about it, but of course, English wouldn't be English without a few exceptions, right?
So there are times when the silent E doesn't disappear.
You bet. For example, with the word see, we keep the E and add ing to make seeing.
So sometimes that silent E wants to stay in the spotlight. English spelling really is a dance between rules and exceptions.
I love that. And just like with dancing, the more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become with the steps.
Speaking of steps, let's look at another suffix that can sometimes cause confusion, cupsily.
Ah, yes, cuswheely. We use it to create adverbs, those words that describe verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. And the rule for adding upsly is pretty straightforward. If a word ends in a consonant, you simply add upsweely.
Like quick becomes quickly and slow becomes slowly.
Exactly. But as you might expect, things get a little trickier when we have words that end in Y.
Oh, here we go again. Does the Y change to an I again?
You're on the right track. If a word ends in a consonant and then a Y, you usually change the Y to an I before adding upsly. So happy becomes happily and easy becomes easily.
Okay, so that Y really is picky about who it hangs out with. But what happens when a word ends in a vowel followed by a Y?
Good question. In those cases, you just add ly directly to the word. You keep the Y exactly as it is.
So play becomes playfully and joy becomes joyfully.
Exactly. It's all about paying attention to those final letters and how they interact with the suffixes.
It's like a giant web of rules.
It can seem that way sometimes, but don't worry. The more you practice, the more you'll start to see the patterns. Shall we revisit those double consonant rules and then tackle the ek versus xk dilemma?
Yes, let's do it. Can you remind me how that floss rule works again?
Of course. The floss rule helps us remember to double those final consonants, especially F, L, and S, just like in the word floss, when we add a suffix to a one-syllable word that has a short vowel sound. So staff becomes staffing, fill becomes filling, and pass becomes passing.
Right. It's like those consonants are giving that short vowel sound some extra oomph. Now, what about gek versus k? When do we use each one?
The key is to listen to the vowel sound that comes before the K sound. If it's a short vowel sound, you use A. But if you hear a long vowel sound or a consonant before that K sound, you just use A.
So duck has a short vowel sound and uses ache, but peak has a long vowel sound and just uses ache. It seems simple enough, but I can definitely see how it could be easy to mix them up.
Definitely. But don't worry, the more you see these words in your reading and writing, the more natural those spelling choices will become.
I'm feeling much more confident about tackling those tricky spellings. We've covered so much in this deep dive, so what's coming up in our final part?
In the last part of our deep dive, we'll do a quick recap of all 12 spelling rules, and then we'll talk about some practical tips for your English spelling journey. Things you can do every day to keep improving.
Welcome back to our final part of this deep dive into English spelling. We've covered so much ground, from tricky Y endings to inseparable QU buddies and even silent E ninjas.
It's been a whirlwind tour of spelling rules. And, learning a new language without that traditional elementary school foundation, that's really remarkable.
It really is. You're all creating your own unique learning journey.
Building a solid foundation, brick by brick.
Exactly. And speaking of building blocks, let's do a quick review of those 12 spelling guidelines we've explored. They're like our secret weapons for navigating the sometimes confusing world of English spelling.
Ready for a recap?
Bring it on. We started with that chameleon letter Y. Remember when you add suffixes like ed, or est to words ending in Y.
That Y often changes to an I, but not always.
Right. Cry becomes cried, but play stays played. Oh, and don't forget those irregular plurals like laid that always keep us guessing.
And then we tackled the classic I before E rule.
With that catchy rhyme, I before E except after C.
But of course, there are exceptions.
Always those exceptions, like when A makes an A sound as in neighbor and way.
The word weird is a good reminder that even the most common rules have their quirks.
It's so true. Next, we talked about syllables, the building blocks of words. Every syllable needs a vowel.
Like the word excitement, it has a vowel in each syllable, which gives it that nice flow.
And we explored all those different types of syllables. Open syllables, closed syllables, VCE syllables, R-controlled syllables, vowel team syllables.
Remember chocolate. Knowing that chalk is a closed syllable helped us understand why it's spelled with a short O sound.
So many syllables. And then we journeyed into the world of prefixes and suffixes, those little word parts that can really change things up.
We learned that al is like a shortcut for all, and that those in endings often make silent es disappear.
But not always. There are always exceptions, right?
Absolutely. English loves to keep us on our toes.
And who could forget the floss rule? Doubling those final consonants, F, L, and S, when we add suffixes to words like staff, fill, and pass.
It helps to keep those short vowel sounds nice and strong.
And then we talked about sick versus K, meek after a short vowel, and K after a long vowel or consonant.
Look versus peak.
It's all about those subtle sound differences. Wow, we've covered a lot. But now that we've explored these 12 spelling rules, what advice would you give to our listeners who are just starting their English spelling journey, especially since they're in a new country?
That's a great question. First of all, be patient with yourselves. Learning a new language takes time, and it's okay to make mistakes. In fact, mistakes are how we learn.
That's so important. Don't be afraid of those mistakes.
And remember, there's a whole world of support out there for English language learners. Don't hesitate to ask for help from teachers, tutors, or online resources.
There are so many amazing resources available now. And don't forget to make learning fun. Maybe try some word games or flashcards with these rules.
Those are great ideas, and one of the best ways to improve your spelling is simply to read, read, read. Immerse yourself in the English language.
Read everything you can get your hands on.
Mm.
Books, magazines, even those cereal boxes.
And pay attention to the world around you. Look at signs, menus, advertisements, and notice how words are spelled in different situations. It's like a fun little spelling scavenger hunt.
I love that, turning everyday life into a learning opportunity.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone on this journey. Millions of people around the world are learning English, and we're all in this together.
That's a great reminder. We're all part of a global learning community. And you've already come so far by taking on this challenge of learning English in a new country. So keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep celebrating your progress.
We're so proud of you all for taking this deep dive into English spelling. You're doing amazing.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into English spelling. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another exciting adventure in language.